Good morning, good afternoon. Whoops. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Sharon Florentine. Welcome to today's webinar, Who Owns Kubernetes? The Why and How of Kubernetes Service Ownership, brought to you by Fairwinds. We have an awesome webinar for you as usual, but before we get started, I need to go through some housekeeping items with you. First of all, please remember that the session is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of it, please know that you can go back and watch it again. We are taking questions throughout the presentation, so make sure and put those questions in the Q&A tab on your webinar console, and we will try and get to as many as possible as we can after the presentation. Finally, we're going to do a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stick around until the end and see if you are a winner. And also, we are going to do some audience polling today. So when you see those questions pop up on your screen, we would really appreciate it if you could take a couple seconds and give us your responses. So with that, I am pleased to introduce to you today Kendall Miller and Joe Pelletier. Okay.
Excellent.
Pretty good. From Fairwinds. Gentlemen, I'm going to stop talking and let you get right into it.
All right, thanks, Sharon. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. If you are here for Who Owns Kubernetes, the why and how of Kubernetes service ownership, you are in the right spot. That is what we're going to be talking about today. And let's go ahead and dive in a little bit. So real quick, my name's Kendall. I'm president at Fairwinds, which we'll tell you about in just a second. Been involved in the company from early on. We've been in business about 6.5 years now. Wow, that's kind of scary to say out loud, Joe. And been doing Kubernetes for the vast majority of that as a company. So, Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Thanks, Kendall. My name is Joe Pelletier. I head up the product side of things here at Fairwinds. Been with Fairwinds for about a couple years. My background's in DevOps, cloud, and security. So really excited to talk to you all today about service ownership.
All right. And a little bit of background on Fairwinds, why we are the ones here talking about this. So as I mentioned, we've been in business about 6.5 years, focused as a Kubernetes company for the vast majority of that. We have a number of different things that we do at the company. Historically, it's been heavily focused on services. We've had people come to us and say, make my Kubernetes problem go away. We can build and maintain a Kubernetes-based infrastructure. Well, we've done that for lots and lots of companies over the years, maintaining lots of Kubernetes clusters across the 3 major clouds. And that gives us insight into some of the macro level problems that everybody has with Kubernetes. As a result, we solve some of those problems with open source tooling. There's a lot of things out there that we have built for helping to manage a Kubernetes-based environment in any environment, be that in any cloud or on-prem. And then we have taken some of those open source tools and built an enterprise software solution above and beyond that. So we have a SaaS platform that does enable service ownership for Kubernetes. It's policy-driven configuration validation, basically a home inspector to your fire alarm. So you probably have a monitoring tool out there that tells you if your house is on fire. Our tool tells you if your house looks like it's going to catch on fire or how fast it's going to burn when it does. And we'll get to that a little bit towards the end. We'll even have a brief demo to show you what that looks like. But that's who Fairwinds is. All we do is Kubernetes, so Joe and I are excited to talk about this because this is the world and the water that we swim in. So thanks for joining us, and let's go ahead and dive in. So let's talk about the infrastructure ownership divide here, Joe.
So Kendall, I think we might have had a poll question we want to kick
Oh, yes.
off
Did
with.
I skip right over that? Thank
Yes.
you. I'm sorry. I clicked too fast. Yeah, so go ahead and everybody vote on this real quick. Where are you in your Kubernetes journey? We like to understand this for the sake of knowing where the audience is at, as well as it's helpful for us to collect over time and see how people are progressing. But are you just learning about containers in Kubernetes? Are you planning on using it in the next 6 to 12 months? Are you using it only in testing or dev? Are you all the way to production, or do you have no plans to use Kubernetes? Go ahead and spend a second, fill that out.
Wow, we got a lot of responses coming in fast and furious here. So I'm just going to leave it up for another couple seconds. And then, Kendall, I don't know if you wanted to go ahead and read the results, or you want me to go ahead and grab that, or
I can read the results when you close the poll. I'm pretty sure. If I
Fantastic.
have a problem, I'll let you know. But I think
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and close that then and turn it over to you.
Okay, so looks like we have. Wow, I'm just looking at this. I'm learning about containers in Kubernetes is about 37% of you. Planning to use it in the next 6 to 12 months is 14%. Using it only in testing or dev environment is also 14%. And then using it in production is 26%, with 9% of you having no plans to use it. So the vast majority of people are in the just learning or already using it in production, which makes sense. That jives with a lot of the demographics that we've seen, both just in general, people are just dipping their toe in or just learning about it, looking to dip their toe in. And then there's a small percentage that's in production and looking at figuring out how to better operationalize that. So that lines up with some of our understanding already, but we'll talk a little bit to all of these things as we go. So thank you, Joe, for backing me up. Now let's talk about the infrastructure ownership divide. So let's, at a high level, I think that as we talk about service ownership, where are the lines between who owns what's infrastructure? What is infrastructure and what's not infrastructure? Where's the service end and the infrastructure begin? And go ahead and dive in a little bit on that, Joe.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and one that from when we talk to clients, it's really this philosophy around enabling teams who build software to also be able to ship it and run it as well, right? And I think for many companies that ideology falls on a spectrum, right? There are some companies where there still might be some silos, but there's other companies where they're looking to really kind of enable this service ownership mentality. And I think a lot of times too, when we think about that dividing line, right? Like it can be different depending on the type of infrastructure that you're running. And for Kubernetes, I think the unique thing about Kubernetes is it's a very consistent API, right? You can use Kubernetes on premise, you can use it across all the major cloud providers. And so it provides this interesting kind of technical foundation to really build sort of the people and processes around enabling service ownership. So, from my experience, I think service ownership is a topic that, does come up, looking at the poll results, we have a spectrum of we have different, groupings of folks who are either not familiar with Kubernetes or already running it. I think it can apply to any part of the, it's a consideration for any part of your Kubernetes maturity as well. And I think that's something that, we'll be touching upon later in the conversation.
Yeah, no matter where you are in your adoption, it's something you're thinking about. And I think part of the reason we're talking about this, Kubernetes has become a buzzword in the DevOps world, right? And service ownership is sort of a larger superset maybe of some of what's going on in DevOps. And we're going to get a little bit into that in just a second, but let's talk about this slide first here, Joe.
Well, yeah, it's funny that you brought that up, right? Because a lot of times when we talk about service ownership, folks are saying, "Hey, isn't that really DevOps?" Right? And at the end of the day, it really, a lot of it is following the DevOps philosophy, right? I think we hear about service ownership come up because we're trying to talk about the nuances of that, that those dividing lines, I guess, between who owns what, and at a very high level, I think. In the Kubernetes context, there's definitely a question around who owns the deployment to Kubernetes, right? And if you're, at the end of the day, if you're a product team and you're, working on your application, you're there to serve customer needs, you're building new features, you have to get those features out to production as quickly as you can. And there's certain aspects of your application that, tend to be owned by the product team, whereas other aspects of the infrastructure might be owned by another team. And in the Kubernetes land, I think that's really coming, starts with the container image itself. This is something that your dev teams might already know how to, build today. Containers have been around for quite some time, but when it comes to Kubernetes, there's sort of new concepts that get introduced. And these are sort of the deployment configuration, whether it's, the raw YAML file that you are maintaining that tells Kubernetes how to run that container image, or if you're using a package manager like Helm, the teams that ultimately own that configuration file can be a signal of whether or not you're actually, embracing a service ownership type model. And I think, we'll get into some of the details around the considerations for the container image and the deployment configuration and who should make those kind of considerations, as well as how does operations help provide guidance for service owners as well.
Yeah, and I do just want to back up for a second, and I think we're assuming a lot here that probably we can assume, but in case we can't, Kubernetes is this tool that people are increasingly using for container orchestration to manage compute at scale in a data center or cloud. So if you don't know that that's what Kubernetes is, just at a base level, that's what it is. So when we're talking about people shipping workloads to Kubernetes, we're talking about the applications that are shipping into Kubernetes, which is then managing that as they scale or do internal communication, et cetera. But I think that's probably obvious to this whole crowd, but just to make sure that I level set. So talk about some of these different adoption models that you've touched a little bit on, Joe, but go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great foundation, right? Like with Kubernetes, it really does unlock a lot of flexibility and power around building great infrastructure. And we know that building great infrastructure is still a hard thing to do, right? And so depending on the company that you're working in, you might see, one of three different types of kind of Kubernetes adoption models, right? Which in both of these, or all of these adoption models will kind of dictate sort of how service ownership is also adopted in your organization. So just to kind of take a step back, there are some companies where we call it sort of the complete ownership by operations model, where operations is typically its own team of called infrastructure, operations, sometimes platform engineering, where that team is responsible for building out the core Kubernetes control plane, as well as all that core infrastructure to serve up the applications. And they may even take a step further and own the deployment configuration for those application teams. And I think in certain types of smaller organizations where there's just a single product that you're shipping to Kubernetes, this is typically the model, because those teams are, at the end of the day, they're it's a small company, so the team that runs Kubernetes is going to kind of own the full stack, right? And that does work, I think, pretty well up into a certain point. And that's the point where those companies end up scaling. They end up acquiring lots of different product teams, or they expand their product portfolio. And now Kubernetes, goes from being the infrastructure to more of the platform foundation to enable lots of teams to deploy their apps. And I think that's really an introduction to our second model here around the shared ownership. Kendall, what do you see though? Is that sort of your experience in terms of seeing how companies progress over time?
Yeah, well, I think we're talking about Kubernetes as this tool for doing container orchestration. And it really, we don't have a framework that's really great in the world for building infrastructure as code, but Kubernetes is kind of as close as we get. And it's not even quite a framework. It's really somebody giving you rebar and cement and saying, good luck, buddy. We hope you know what you're doing. And you have to know how to go build from there. So there are a lot of companies like Joe's talking about. The team that builds the infrastructure, manages the infrastructure, makes sure that nothing is ever deployed into that infrastructure if they didn't touch it. And that's the old-fashioned throw it over the wall to operations, pre-DevOps model. And then as companies grow and mature, really that's not scalable. Like if you're pushing deployments with any kind of regularity, if you have any significant number of services that are running, particularly in a microservice architecture, you're going to have to push things down and enable teams to deploy their own things. So a lot of times in bigger companies, we'll see that platform team building and managing the tools to enable the developers. Sometimes it's called developer enablement. There's lots of different names for that. Where those lines are is always a little hazy, but yeah, get to the complete service ownership thing that you're going to talk about next.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a great point, right? Like I think as those, if we think about the companies that have grown and they're now serving lots of different development teams, that there's definitely that point where like, how do we make sure that us as the platform engineering team, we have that solid infrastructure available and that we're enabling dev to ship faster, but also be able to kind of own certain aspects of their container and their configuration, so that we as a platform engineering team can support lots of different groups getting their applications out. And that's really a necessity just to get closer to your customer, right? Like if you're beholden to one group in an organization to get your application out there, you're not going to be able to ship as fast, and you're not going to be able to learn as much about what's happening to your application in production. And so, service ownership by some, in some nature, is a way just to get closer to the customer and go faster as a business. So I think if we kind of on this next slide here, one of the things I wanted to kind of share is, when we think about those core, when it comes to Kubernetes, those core artifacts around what who owns what, right? When it comes to the container and the configuration, is that something that a dev team is typically going to own, or is that something that your ops team is going to own? And really, there's a bunch of kind of key considerations that you have to sort of answer about those applications, right? And some of these things are only the product team or the dev team might actually know the answer to, right? So one question could be, from a security perspective, what permissions does this application need when it's running in production, right? There's general best practices around security permissions, but sometimes, depending on the application's need, it needs to be configured in a certain way. There's also reliability scenarios, which version of the application should be being deployed, and also around efficiency and scalability. How much compute should I be giving to this app as well? And so a lot of these scenarios are where development can own a little bit of that responsibility, where ops is there to provide guidance and help development be successful with getting their apps out to Kube.
Yeah, and like that's the thing is, if you have if you want to push for service ownership, which again we're going to get a little bit more into in just a second, the owner of the service needs to understand all of these different layers, like Joe's talking about, and it's not common for the average developer, particularly some very experienced developers think about these things, but it's not common for particularly a new developer or even a mid-level developer to stop and think before they're pushing code. Is this, like, not just does my code work, is this solving the problem or building the feature that I need, but also is it configured correctly? Is it the right versions? Is it scaled right or sized right? Does it have the right permissions, et cetera? And so that's what Joe's getting to. And our argument is you do need tooling to expose the right things in order to enable some of this service ownership. So
yeah, great point.
Let's stop and just level set for a second. What are we talking about when we're talking about service ownership? And we're stealing this definition from PagerDuty, who has a whole big write-up on what service ownership looks like, because part of service ownership requires the ability to be alerted when your software has problems. But their definition says full service ownership means that people take responsibility for supporting the software they deliver at every stage of the software or service lifecycle. So that means the developer that writes the code, that builds the back end of the application, or in some cases the front end of the application, when they push that code through, they're stopped and they are responsible for the testing of that application. They have a good test suite in place to make sure it's using the right versions, there's not known CVEs, et cetera. When it gets to production, they're responsible for making sure it's working in production. If it goes down in production, they're responsible for having the tools in place to know it went down, why it went down, and they're empowered to go about fixing it and pushing a new version out. That's what full service ownership looks like. Joe, anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a good summary, and I think PagerDuty does a great job defining it as well. You brought up a point earlier though, which is around making sure, like, if we're asking teams to be responsible more for their applications in production, we have to give them the tools to be successful, right? And that's part of, I think, the journey here is not only are there people and process changes, but there's also some tooling and technology additions, and we'll kind of cover what those are as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, like, and just to even a high level on this, since we're talking about PagerDuty, like I mentioned, if you're not empowered to be alerted when something goes wrong, you can't have true service ownership. If the only team that gets paged is the operations team or the infrastructure team when the service goes awry, service ownership isn't possible. So let's talk about why on service ownership. We touched a little bit on this, that as companies get to a certain scale, it just becomes impossible to do it any other way. And I think about lots of different organizations I know that get just bigger and bigger and bigger, and some of the dysfunctional ones still have a cloud team or an infrastructure team, and they are the blocker on every single thing that happens. And every time there is a company priority or a business priority, it gets stopped by that team who has to reevaluate everything, make sure it's going to work, test it in a staging or a dev environment before they can push it to production, and it just slows everything down, can grind it to a halt.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky balance, right? Because I think we're going to touch upon some of the challenges as well. But at the most fundamental level, a lot of organizations, start thinking about this concept because they just have to go faster, right? It's not even a we want to save money type question. It's more of how do we better compete in the market? And 100% of the time, it means being able to meet get closer to your customer, meet them where they are, and also be able to, ship new products and capabilities to that customer quicker. And so this need for velocity becomes incredibly important, right? And when it comes to sort of, software development, some of the handoffs that are created in the software development process can slow teams down. So service ownership is really around that empowerment, right? And to empower those teams, there is an aspect of, bringing it is very much sort of the DevOps philosophy. It's being able to, create some more of the shared ownership around the application and around sort of the, in this case, the infrastructure as well. I think understanding the challenges, though, is really important, because I think from our conversations, lots of customers really want to understand how to get there, but they realize there's some inertia, and they realize that it's not just going to be one thing or one tool that they bring in that changes the culture. And I think that's starts highlighting some of the challenges around getting to service ownership.
Yeah, and Joe, before we dive into that, first of all, I just want to pause and say, feel free to ask questions as we go along. We did just have a question come through on the Q&A. I'll try to keep my eye on that. We will get to questions at the end if we don't address them as we go. But this first question is, would service ownership be at a microservice level? So the short answer of that is you can have service ownership with a monolith. It just tends to be, yes, as an organization is breaking up into more and more microservices, or we're as services, that's when you start to see this service ownership model really find maturity. Yeah. And to some of what Joe's talking about, it pushes that ownership closer to the customer. It pushes ownership closer to the team that actually is responsible for that customer, and that just enables a scale that's really different. So yes, it's part of the move to microservices often, but it's not a one-to-one comparison. Anything to add there, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, right? I mean, a lot of companies are starting to embrace microservices too, right? And I think in that model where you are breaking up pieces, if you're going from a monolith to a microservice, say, or if you're just even starting with microservices, there's a natural aspect of ownership over different parts of the application, right? And we like to use this example at Fairwinds where, let's imagine we're running an e-commerce company, and we have to make sure that parts of the application around the search functionality or the shopping cart functionality can scale independently so that we can meet customer needs depending on the time of day or the seasonality of our business. And to do that, you really need to get those teams to kind of see, understand, and respond not only to customer requirements, but what's happening to the application in production, right? And so that's a great question, because it does lead into a little bit of how you think about your overall architecture and infrastructure, and being able to break down some of those silos to get that information over the teams who can make a difference. Yeah,
great. Okay, so then back to the challenges of getting here. Some of it is scale, right? Like when you have a small team, like we've talked about, having one service, it's sometimes just easier to have an ops team that's responsible for it. Yeah. And so as the organization grows, it becomes a necessity, but that also means you start to have different teams responsible for different things. We've said you need great tooling in order to do this, so you have to be at a certain scale where you are building out tooling, building out processes that are repeatable across the organization. If, as an organization, we haven't figured out how to even monitor our own services, we're not at a spot where having service ownership is going to be possible. We have to know what to monitor, how to monitor it. We need to know when things are down. We need to have some tooling in place to understand why it's down so that we can respond appropriately. But getting that process, getting that tools, and even the education required to know what we're doing is all part of what a lot of companies really struggle with.
Yeah. And so on this next slide, we actually break down the challenges, I think, into three nice categories here, right? So like the first one, to your point, Kendall, was really around the cultural change, right? Like this notion of doing handoffs and creating autonomy and accountability, it really requires, buy-in from the leadership team so that you can, create the space for those teams to start adapting to these new expectations and to these new paradigms, right? The interesting thing is, as companies end up moving to Kubernetes, we see a lot of these questions open up around, who's going to own certain aspects of the infrastructure. And Like we mentioned, as a business, I think Kubernetes lends itself really well to create, enabling a service ownership or even enabling a self-service type of mindset because of the consistency of the APIs across different platforms. But it really does start with that cultural change and the need to be able to create space for teams to adapt. The second part here is really around self-service. So like the tooling points that you were bringing out, Kendall, it's important to, be able to, first have a good foundation of tooling. And a lot of that means having, systems like monitoring and alerting in place, so that you can be responsive to production. But increasingly, especially around technologies like Kubernetes, it means, being able to get access to best practices, being able to implement policies and guardrails so that as teams deploy to Kube, they're getting the feedback around whether or not their application is meeting the production readiness expectations or not, right? And so that's another way to sort of enable and create these guardrails around service ownership.
Yeah, great. And you want to touch on consistency, or you feel like you got that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the consistency thing is really the benefit of ops, right? Like at the end of the day, service ownership is it's enabling product teams to be, more agile and kind of deploy the apps and get visibility into their apps in production. But for ops, it also means being able to establish consistent core infrastructure. So when we translate this to the Kubernetes world, a lot of challenge that we see with companies, that have lots of teams deploying to the same cluster, let's say, is being able to do upgrades or being able to enforce certain consistent best practices can be a challenge. And embracing a certain service ownership mindset can allow you to, create more consistency so that you can do those upgrades, you can support multiple teams with a certain, readiness criteria in place. Consistency is really a challenge, but it's also can be the benefit of moving into this model. Yeah,
great. And we've touched a lot on this, but some of the tools that are required to get to sane service ownership are, CICD tooling. If a developer has to understand everything about the infrastructure in order to deploy an application into it, you're probably not going to be able to enable service ownership at scale. So building out CI/CD tooling so that a developer's just pushing code in a way they're already familiar with, and something else notices that push and picks it up and makes sure it can be deployed in an appropriate way. That's one of the first important steps. There's a reason why CI/CD goes real hand in hand with DevOps practices. You need a sane place to deploy to. Again, Kubernetes and an awful lot for us because that's our focus. There are other places to deploy to that aren't Kubernetes. Heroku is one of the things that comes top of mind, but other PaaS is out there. Go ahead, Joe.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I think that's all key points. I mean, the one thing I was just actually responding to was on the Q&A, there was a question around kind of microservices level security, like how important is that, right? And that's a little bit of sort of why, monitoring and observability tools are key for being responsive to workloads in production. But, you also need to be able to implement that security tooling as early as the development process all the way through to production so that you can enforce, strong microservice level security. Part of that means, kind of even things like monitoring container images for known vulnerabilities. Doing that in the CI process as well as in the runtime, and then making sure that your microservices are configured with the right configuration so that you're adding additional defense in depth. You don't want to be able to give security context to certain microservices if they don't need it. So I think it is important, and that there's actually tooling in place now in the Kubernetes landscape, which we'll talk about, that can give you some of that benefit.
Well, and to touch on that, we've got policy here, governance here, but the reason that microservice level security matters is because you can have seemingly the least important microservice in an application. To go back to Joe's e-commerce site, right? So you have a site and the shopping is one service and the cart is one service. And let's say you have a third service that seems almost irrelevant. All it does is handle your ads, right? But if your ad service, even if it's the smallest of the services or has the least of whatever, if that gets compromised and it's running in your environment, it has access to everything else. And so the least secure piece of your infrastructure, even if it's the smallest, seemingly least consequential microservice, if that gets compromised, everything's compromised. So how worried are enterprises about microservice level security? The answer is very, and probably still insufficiently. They should be worried about it. Security matters, and it's the kind of thing that people need to be more tuned into than they often are.
I mean, I think that's a good point to talk about what does like great look like, right? What does a mature service ownership model look like here? And I think on the next slide, Kendall, we kind of give a few high level bullet points around what mature ownership might look like. And then we'll give a sort of a more real world example around like how you could update a development process to integrate service ownership best practices. But kind of why don't you kick us off with some of these first examples here, though?
Yeah, so I think repeatable onboarding workflows for teams. So that means an ops team or somebody is building a repeatable way to build and deliver services. They're building a repeatable way to monitor those services. They're building a repeatable way to be alerted on those services, to update those services, et cetera. So I'm a developer. I need to push code. Let's say it's something small. I need to move this image 5 pixels that way. If I write that code, push it into a repo, somebody else has to take a look at that. Somebody else in test has to run it through a test suite. Somebody else then in operations has to approve it. It could be weeks to get that image moved 5 pixels to the left. But if I completely own that service and the tools are in place to get me there, I can press some buttons, do it all from a command line as the case may be, but get a couple things through, and I can see real quick with a short feedback loop, oh, I actually moved it 7 pixels to the left when I meant to move it 5, or whatever the issue is, right? And then I can go fix it again. So in an ideal world, it's that self-service tooling, it's that automated feedback loop, it's that quick ability to own everything all the way through, because sometimes as much as you work to make your staging and dev environments look exactly like your production environment, sometimes it's different. That's the secret. And you need to be able to see what it looks like in production.
Yeah, that's obviously a key reason to enable service ownership, right? Give those teams the ability to kind of deploy and see their application and get those changes out to customers as quickly as possible. I think another area where, service ownership is important is the feedback loops, right? Those, in addition to some of the core aspects of just deploying and running apps, you also need to make sure that you're meeting certain production readiness goals, right? Especially in a model where you've got maybe a platform engineering team who is managing that core infrastructure, but there's certain kind of boundaries in terms of how an application should be configured before it gets deployed. And a couple examples might be, making sure that every time you deploy an application to Kubernetes, you're setting, the required memory or CPU, or you're setting the correct health probe so Kubernetes knows how to restart that application if anything happened, right? There are certain basic expectations that apps may need to be configured with in order for you to really kind of enable a service ownership model that's also production grade and ready to accept workloads from lots of different teams. So, from our perspective at Fairwinds, there's a few different integration points here that are should be considered. The first one's going to be back as early as your Git repo, where you're managing your containers or where you're managing your configuration. And this is really where you want to check for known vulnerabilities or whether or not your configuration is aligned with best practices, right? There's lots of interesting tools out there today that can give you that feedback. And it can go a long way for ensuring that you've got those guardrails in place at the time of deployment. And the second area is one I'll call at the deploy time, where you really enforce that production readiness criteria. This is where companies might create sort of policies around security or compliance to make sure that, again, applications are being deployed that meet certain requirements, like not containing any sort of high critical CVEs, or making sure that for certain namespaces, applications are not being deployed with privileged access. There's certain general best practices that you'll want to enforce at the time of deployment, and make sure that teams can get that feedback into their workflows.
And Joe, part of the reason that we have, even these different entry points, yes, there's in an ideal world, stuff moves from left to right here. And everything that's deployed goes through a Git repo, goes through a CI process, goes whatever. But part of the reason we even stop and double check things, even at this deploy, the admission controller space in Kubernetes, is sometimes people go around the process. They just want to throw something in there. They know a way to work around it. And so making sure that you also have checks even at this spot is kind of key and essential. And keep going, Joe, on the production monitoring.
Yeah, and then production monitoring, I mean, this can be a lot of things, right? I mean, I think it's as important as making sure you have the right infrastructure monitoring and alerting tools in place, right? So that you have that real-time visibility into how well your workloads or your microservices are responding to customer traffic. But it could also mean making sure that you're like if you're in the platform engineering team, making sure you're monitoring workloads to be compliant to your policies, or identifying configuration issues that could eventually lead to an incident, right? Like a workload might appear to be running perfectly fine, but if it's misconfigured and doesn't have health probes in place, should that workload encounter some sort of issue, it may not actually become available again as you expect. And so there's certain types of configuration gotchas that you want to be able to monitor for in production.
Great. And let's talk about the evolution of service ownership in an organization. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about this, I guess, already. How you can move from just having a wall that things are thrown over to some amount of service ownership and the progress of that. In the old world, it really is just throw things over the fence and let another team manage it. In a new world, we're going to push that closer to everybody else. But is there anything more to say on this, Joe, before we move on?
No, I mean, I think the gist of our conversation's been around like service ownership is not just as straightforward as, rolling out a single tool. It's really a combination, as many things are, people, process, and technology. For us at Fairwinds, we know how to do this with Kubernetes, right? And so I think, looking at our poll results, where over 50% of the audience here is on Kube or thinking about moving to Kube or just here to start learning about Kube and containers. This is a great time to think about, a model that you think is going to be great for your organization going forward, right? Especially if you're in a position where you might be on the operations team today. Let's say you're a platform engineer or an operations engineer, and you realize we're going to have to support lots of different teams on Kubernetes. Service ownership could be, your move to Kubernetes could be a way to also adopt service ownership as well. And I think that's some of the unique opportunities here.
Yeah, I think the move to Kubernetes is a big part of people's adoption of DevOps practices, service ownership being one of those. And if you've watched this whole thing and thought to yourself, well, how the heck do we get there? Boy, have we got a service for you. And we're going to spend a minute and tell you about Fairwinds Insights, which is our software for enabling this for teams that are using Kubernetes so that you can be confident across your organization that what you're deploying and what you're building is secure, efficient, and reliable. It's my opinion that Kubernetes is a big enough buzzword at this point that everyone would be using it if they believed they could do it securely, reliably, and efficiently. And that's why we built Fairwinds Insights. And let me just go ahead and pull up a demo, and I'm just going to walk you through this real quick. So when you log into Insights, most people are going to be in an organization like this. Welcome to Fairwinds Insights. You'll see this big welcome thing. Normally, I do this in another browser, so I skipped the welcome message, but I moved over to Chrome because I was having audio problems earlier today. So anyways, when you log into an organization, you're going to see a couple of different clusters, and I'm just going to dive into one of these and show you what this looks like. So this is a Proxima Prod cluster. You can see when vulnerabilities or action items, things that we need to go address, were introduced into the cluster over this timeline here. We give you an overall health score. We're telling you 81% of the things we checked for are passing. We have 16% warnings and a very small percentage of danger items. So all these checks that we're running to see how you're doing in your Kubernetes environment. And we track that health score over time. You can see we had a bump up here from 81 to 87. And then we also have some cost logic here. I'm not going to show you the entire thing, but I'm going to dig into a few pieces and then talk about the service ownership bits in particular. So that gives you a high-level overview of how you're doing in a cluster level. And you can come in here, click on any one of these action items, and it's going to tell you both what's wrong as well as remediation, so how you can go about fixing this. This is really key because you don't have to have the world's most senior Kubernetes engineers in order to understand how to go knock things out, how to go improve upon vulnerabilities or misconfigurations of any kind. There's a way to mark things as, working as intended, or I'm not going to fix it. You can create tickets. You can assign it to somebody. Again, I'm not going to go into the entire thing. I do want to show you where we're getting a lot of these reports. So we, as I mentioned, have built open source projects to address common problems that we see in the Kubernetes world. So Polaris is a tool of ours that checks for common misconfigurations. That's built in here. That's an open source tool. You can go run that easily on one cluster. As you start to scale, Insights makes this easier to operationalize across lots of clusters. But we also have in here Nova, which checks for Helm charts that are out of date, Pluto checking for deprecated APIs, and then Goldilocks is also one of our open source tools that helps you get your resource requests right. But you'll notice that we also have third-party open source tooling in here. So Trivy checking for container vulnerabilities, KubeBench, KubeHunter, KubeSec, and we also have support for OPA. So if you're looking to write your own custom policy, we have a way to do that. Now, problem is, if you wait until things are in production to be broken, it's too late. And we've spent this entire time talking about service ownership. So I want to show you just real briefly what that looks like with Fairwinds Insights. So here we have a person trying to push some code into a Kubernetes environment. This is the way the average engineer is going to interact with it. And oh goodness, I'm not logged in, which I'm going to do real quick because it shows the demo better. Again, this is the problem with switching browsers last minute, but bear with me. It'll just take me a second. And then having a password manager. Whoop. And oh, and I gotta get a text message. Oh my gosh, this makes the demo so much better to do this in real life like this. Thanks, Joe. This is good. I'm glad that you're here to laugh at it with me. That's better. Okay, so back into here. This is how the average engineer is going to interact with this. They're pushing code. However, this code has the container running as root and has added insecure permissions to the container. So this is exactly what you want in a service ownership world. You've built tests, and you can see Circle CI here. Tests have all passed, but Fairwinds Insights is actually failing this deploy and blocking it from continuing. So I can click on this button, and it's going to load me right into the UI and show me here's some things that need to be changed. This should not be running as privileged, right? Privilege escalation should not be allowed. So it's showing me what the problem is as well as how to go about fixing it. So an engineer doesn't have to have the complete oversight into all the things you're doing in the cluster, but they know I need to fix this in my deployment before I'm going to be able to push my code. You have some tweaks on how strict you want to make this. There's lots of different ways to work within this environment, but if you're using Kubernetes at scale in your organization and you're trying to enable service ownership, improving that health score on your cluster over time is doable outside of just the operations team sitting down with a huge action item list and trying to knock out things. Because you've enabled service ownership, your deployments are going to get healthier and healthier over time as your team is improving upon these things. Anything else to say there, Joe, before I go back?
No, I think that's a good high-level summary. Definitely there to kind of fit it to different parts of your development process and really help you help those operations teams set up guardrails and enable teams to get self-service feedback around their applications and workloads in Kubernetes.
Yeah, and just at a high level, there's integrations with Slack, with Datadog, with GitHub, GitLab, Circle CI, et cetera. There's lots of different places that we build integrations for this so that it fits into the workflows that you already have today.
Yep.
And there's ways to write custom automation as you need. So, and look, there's the demo slide. That's when I was supposed to do the demo. But before we wrap up, we want to do another polling question here towards the end. Is your organization looking to adopt service ownership with Kubernetes? And the options are just starting to think about it, too small to need it, we're planning growth and we know we need to implement it, or we've got it covered. And go ahead and spend a minute filling this out, and we'll tell you what the results of this are. And then we will get to Q&A if there are other questions that have come through. I'm not sure if we've had other things come through, but if you have questions, you can also throw those in now. So go ahead and vote. And we'll leave this open for just a minute longer.
They're trickling in.
Okay, let me go to the results here. So looks like our results are 50% of you just starting to think about service ownership. and 30% are planning with growth and know they need to implement it.
That's great.
19% saying you're too small, and 4%, all of 4% of you saying, no, we got it covered. So, hey, thanks for attending a webinar all about a thing you've already got solved. I actually appreciate that.
Well, I think it goes to show that a lot of companies are, whether you're calling it service ownership or DevOps, because at the end of the day, a lot of these concepts are very similar, right? It does show that a lot of this is important for companies so that they can scale, they can get to meet customer needs and get to production faster, right? I think the unique thing with the fact that you can enable service ownership with Kubernetes, and Kubernetes provides some, really interesting technology benefits around that. Our experience with Kubernetes has really helped us understand how to go faster and enable lots of teams using a cluster, with service ownership. So that's some of the things that I'm really excited about, and it's also awesome to see that most of the folks here are looking to embrace service ownership at their companies.
Yeah. So let's jump into one of these questions, and again, feel free to pop in and ask questions in the Q&A tab here. But one of the questions we have, Joe, is where do we divide roles between platform engineers and SRE versus DevOps engineers?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I think a lot of, depending on the company, these titles can mean very different things, right? I think if we were to kind of take a step back and think about, let's say the team that's responsible for the core Kubernetes infrastructure, let's call them platform engineering or ops teams, right? Those teams are typically building those foundations and those guardrails to enable lots of teams to deploy. And if I'm on a product team, right? Let's say I'm a team full of software engineers and QA engineers. I may also have someone like with the title of a DevOps engineer on that team, right? And their job is to really help enable that individual product team who's responsible for one or maybe a few different microservices to get their apps onto production, right? So I think, in some companies, while the titles can be different, I think there's definitely a melding between these roles where it really comes down to what's your scope of responsibility for the infrastructure, and are you there to help provide guidance to lots of different end customers, or are you there to help enable your team to get the software running on the infrastructure? So it's, again, very high level, but I think I'm trying to think about going back to that earlier slide where we showed the 3 different layers of Kube. That's one way to think about sort of the ownership lines.
Yeah, and I think that the titles are titles, and every organization implements them differently. So what are we calling it? Where do we divide the lines? All of those things are really up to your organization to solve. Who are you going to put in charge of what and where is up for your organization to solve. As long as all of these things that we've talked about are getting addressed, it doesn't really matter if it's SRE doing it or a platform team. Yeah. Define things the way you want to define things, split up the responsibility the way you want to split it up. Just have as an ethos that you're going to push down the ownership as low as possible to enable as much as possible to the developers, or enable as much as possible for the developers that are actually writing that service code.
Yeah.
Another question in here, Joe, are there ways that we can start enabling service ownership earlier on in the journey so that it will be easier as our team scales?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think even, we talked about how like there are some companies where it's a single product, single dev team, right? And ops can typically have enough context to run the full infrastructure. I think a great starting point is really, being able to enable those teams to, own the updates and configuration of their containers and their Kubernetes configuration, and giving them the ability to deploy to Kubernetes on their own, whenever they need to. And as the operations team, you can set up guardrails so that there are certain ways they can avoid making, mistakes around best practices, or you can enforce certain compliance. So there are some technical ways you can kind of, help nudge that team and help provide them guidance around how to own this themselves, while you also put in sort of those guardrails to manage how they deploy going forward. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, it doesn't look like we're having a load of questions come in, so I think we'll wrap up here. I do want to share, and we're a few minutes early, but that's okay. We do have a white paper you can go check out. There's a lot of resources available on the Fairwinds website. It is just fairwinds.com. You can put in the /Kubernetes security best practices and get this white paper, 5 security mistakes that you're probably making. And again, we say this because we see a lot of Kubernetes environments. We know what are the common mistakes that people are making. This is something to get you started. If you are interested in the Insights platform that we shared, we do have a way to turn on a demo environment for you for that. Now, it requires talking to us and getting to know some of our team so we can make you successful with it. But if that's something you're interested in, reach out to our folks. You can reach out to Joe or me directly, or I'm sure that we'll be following up after this with some kind of details and a link to the recording. So with that, thank you so much for attending. And this has been Service Ownership in Kubernetes. And Sharon, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So yeah, I guess it is time for us to announce the winners of our Amazon gift cards for today. And we will start with our first winner, and that is Deborah W. Congratulations to Deborah. Our next winner is Praveen S. Congratulations, Praveen. Next winner is Benir P. Congratulations to you. And finally, Jan M. Congratulations to all our Amazon gift card winners. We will be sending you an email with instructions for claiming your gift card, so keep an eye on your inbox. And if you don't see it there, please check your spam folders. All right, again, this session has been recorded, as Kendall mentioned, so you'll be able to go back and watch it again. We will send everyone an email with instructions for how to do that. So again, check your inbox. Lots of good stuff coming via email. All right, that about does it for me. Thank you all so much for spending your time with us. And thank you again to Kendall and Joe for their amazing presentation and demo. We hope we get to see you again at another webinar soon. I am Sharon Florentine, signing off.
Thanks, Sharon.
Anytime. Always a pleasure.